Hello everyone, and in today's video we're going to be talking about using the camera in fast dual frame mode. And the plan is in the setup that we have today is that we're going to use our cameras to take two very rapid interframe images using the iStar sCMOS. Now this mode of operation, also known as PIV or PIV mode, is ideal for applications where you need to resolve two spatial events with the minimum interframe gap possible, or in instances where, say, you're planning to take two images and you want one image that is like a background reference image frame, maybe with some kind of background illumination or something like that, right before you take the main frame you want to take of some kind of illuminated phenomena. And this then allows you to get the best signal possible. So first I'll start by talking a bit about the particular setup we're using today.
Okay, so in the diagram we're going to use for this demonstration, we'll be talking when we're showing fast dual frame setup. We're going to have again our iStar sCMOS camera, and we'll have a laptop which is connected through USB software, and we'll also have the gate monitor from the camera connected to an oscilloscope, so we can see when gating is occurring. We'll also have a fire out from the back of the camera so we can see when the sensor is active or inactive. And we also have an external trigger linked to our digital delay generator. The external trigger will drive the gating of the photocathode. We'll also have a pre-trigger that comes from the digital delay generator. And so the pre-trigger will drive the sensor acquisition. And this pre-trigger will also be fed into the oscilloscope and to the camera so we can see when we're pre-triggering the camera. And we will also have an arm monitor attached from the back of the camera into the oscilloscope. And this will then give us information about when the camera is actually willing to accept gating pulses from the external trigger. And I'll go into sort of how this looks on the oscilloscope in our setup in a few minutes. In terms of the ports we're using for this particular setup, so obviously this is a bit more complicated than what we've had previously, so I thought I'd explain just how we've got the back of the camera set up in our actual demo. So we're using the external trigger port at the back here in red. We've got the arm, and we've also got fire out. We've also obviously got our power, and we've got our pre-trigger in. We're also using, and we also have our USB. So as you can imagine, if you have a look now, we have quite the sprawling mass of wires on our table here and coming out of the back of the camera. So for instance, in blue and orange, we have our arm trigger going into our oscilloscope. We have our green and yellow wire, which is our external trigger. We just have it linked from the DUG into the back of the camera. And we also have our yellow wire, which is our pre-trigger input from the digital delay generator into the back of the camera. And we also have our gate monitor from the back of the camera into the oscilloscope as well. So in terms of what we expect the time diagram to look for this fast dual frame or sort of PIV imaging mode is, well, if we take a look at it, we're probably looking at some kind of event, or where we want to image two things that are happening quickly in quick succession. And so what we have is we have some kind of pre-trigger that is driving our sensor. And so when the sensor is receiving the pre-trigger signal, we're basically turning our sensor on. And we're generating these imaging pairs of frames with this quick interframe time. And so what's happening, like mid-sensor exposure, when this next pre-trigger comes in, that's then triggering it to stop that exposure and start the next frame. And we then also have our photocathode gating, which is being driven by our external trigger in our setup, and and we've got this set up to generate these image pairs, which then occur during our events that we're interested in, and that's more or less how it should go. So. But now, in reality, when we actually have this setup in our particular setup, where we're driving everything off one digital delay generator, because we're in PIV mode, we also have our arm signal. And what our arm signal does is when it's high, it gives an indication that the sensor is ready to the photocathode is ready to accept a signal from the external trigger to trigger this image pair. Because you can imagine if you have this repeating from your external trigger, you would actually have it also occurring in this sort of area time-wise. So because we've set it in PIV mode, we get this arm signal which sort of just shows you what's going on, which actually shows you the time in which the setup is willing to receive these gate pulses and when it's not. And that then allows us to construct these image pairs. And we'll now go onto our oscilloscope and have a look at what happens when we press acquire in software and see what we get.
So in terms of our software settings for this particular setup, we've got our camera set up in kinetic series mode. We have our trigger mode set to external exposure and just kinetic series length of 4. We've also got overlap mode ticked, and we made a point that for this demo, because we wanted to show it in the best way possible in the oscilloscope, we have, as you see, the width of 128 pixels by 8 pixels. This simply is so we can take these images so quickly together that we can get what you'll see is like get 2 PIV series on the same oscilloscope trace. And in gating, we've got our width set to 1 microsecond. And we've got our insertion delay set to fast. Additionally, we have PIV mode ticked in the 3 dots next to trigger mode.
So just before we acquire an image, I'll also point out that we have our digital delay generator set up in burst mode at 100 kilohertz, and we have it set up to give us 2 pulses per burst, and we're driving the camera using just 1 digital delay generator. So we're using the 2 outputs, as you can see over here. Yeah, so we're driving 2 outputs from the digital delay generator to trigger our external trigger and our pre-trigger signals into the back of the camera. So we have our pre-trigger set up with a 3.4 microsecond delay width. We also have, so these pulses that we're using, they're 35 periods apart, so that equates to 350 microseconds. So if we just press acquire now, we can see here on our oscilloscope that we've generated a pattern. I admit slightly before this demo we had a bit of a play around to make sure everything would fit well onto the screen. And so if we open this in our browser software where we can see clearly what's actually going on, if we just have a look here, you'll see in green that we have up here, we have our arm signal in green. This shows you the time in which the system is willing to accept pulses to actually trigger the gating. And you'll see here then that the gating correlates to these time periods where the arm signal is up, but there are no gate signals detected in the time when the arm signal is down. You'll see here in blue, we have our pre-trigger pulses, which are driving our gating, and you see then how this correlates with, as I mentioned before, the arm signal, that they're occurring here. There's no gating occurring because the gate here is in pink. But here where the pre-trigger occurs during the up arm signal, here up next to the up arm signal, a gate is occurring. And then you can see here, because we set it to a kinetic series of 4 images, you can see how we have the sensor being activated and 4 times in a row with these short interframe gap of 2 microseconds in between frames. So now what we'll do is, I think I'll just zoom in on the oscilloscope and we'll have a look at the finer details of this. So I've just zoomed in on the oscilloscope trace that we were looking at a second before. And what you can see here is that we have, well, firstly, that our arm signal is obviously the same height regardless and high, because we're in the period of time now where the arm is high. And you can see here that we have our pre-trigger signal occurring, and where this pre-trigger signal occurs here, you can see where this pre-trigger signal occurs. You can see that the sensor then ends its frame and then begins its next frame, and that's because this is the sensor fire signal here in aqua. And then you can also see that our photocathode gates, which are being triggered by our external trigger, which we slightly offset in the digital delay generator by 3.4 microseconds in the opposite way, are shifted slightly to the left, and that hence you can see that one gate pulse is happening in this sensor frame, and one gate pulse is happening in this sensor frame. So I hope this gives you a bit of a good idea as to what, the kind of sort of oscilloscope traces and the timing diagrams and the timing considerations you may have to look at if you're trying to use this rapid interframe technique. So one thing I think is worth mentioning is how it's possible to achieve the minimum fast interframe time, because though electrically 2 microseconds is the time frame you'll see between two frames. So for instance, image frame 1, image frame 2, when you're looking at the pulses you get off your oscilloscope, you'll only see 2 microseconds as like, this is as small as you can make it and as small as the software will allow you to make it. But what's actually happening down at the sensor level is there's actually a crossover point where frame 1 physically is ending and frame 2 is actually physically ending. So what this means is actually that you can get closer than 2 microseconds from one frame to another. You just have to be aware that as you as the sensor moves the charge from the pixel into its buffer and begins exposing for frame 2, there's this crossover point. But what you can do here then is, if you can scan through with a laser at various different timescales, or as I'll demonstrate in a minute, if you've got 2 frames, you can sort of scan over this and look for this crossover point. And this is great because what actually means is you can have then 2 laser pulses or phenomena, whatever you're trying to look at, up to anywhere between 100 to 300 nanoseconds apart, and get these really quick sort of interframe times. And then you can gate this obviously with this pulse to then capture that. So I just thought it's worth mentioning this, and it's something worth being aware of, that just because it says 2 microseconds, that's not necessarily the minimum time. You actually can get somewhere in the region of 100 to 300 nanoseconds. So one thing to be aware of though is the phosphor decay time and how that plays a role in this, is that you may need your P46 phosphor as opposed to P43 because you're going down to this really short time scale where you get into the realms where the actual decay of the phosphor may start to overlap from the first image to the second image, and that's something worth factoring into your considerations if you're doing this sort of thing. So one thing that you can do when with this optical transition is to map it out so that you have your frames, if you're trying to look at something very close together and you're trying to maximize or minimize, should I say, the interframe time. One thing that would be ideal would be to have a way of pulsing, generating a pulse to your gate, with correlating with some kind of light source or laser to then map out each time section across this with intensity in each image, and then you could map out what this sort of crossover point looks like for your particular camera. So what I thought would be quite good for us just to show now is, so we've got this optical interframe, and I just want to show a very simple way that you can chart out this optical interframe by literally just having some light in front of your camera and a digital delay generator and using gate mode. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take a single gated pulse, and using gate mode we're just going to take lots of frames across this optical timing, this inter-optical frame area, and we're going to do this in PIV mode. So we're going to have 2 frames running, and what we'll see is difference in intensity in frame 1 when the gate is on frame 1, and then as we go towards frame 2 we'll see this intensity start to shift and move over to frame 2. And this could be a simple way of mapping out, sort of the kind of the interoptical, the sort of, I say almost the crosstalk you get between these two frames when you get around this area. And so, yeah, we're going to do this using PIV mode, as I say, with gate step mode. So we'll take loads of frames at a small time scale, maybe like 10 nanoseconds or so, and we'll see what this actually looks like in reality. And then we'll take a region of interest from each of the pictures, each of the frames, and then plot the intensity of frame 1 and frame 2, and have a look at how that changes.
So how we're going to do this, and how we're going to walk through the interframe gap, is if you imagine got it set up here, we've got our gate in position in time, and so we're going to set our settings so that we take 1,000 pairs of PIV images, with the gate stepping forward 10 nanoseconds in time per image, and we're going to set this to start a certain distance before the sort of crossover region in the interframe area. So we're going to take a stack of PIV images, and simultaneously, while we're taking this stack, we're going to take a region of interest from the middle of each of these images, and we'll then plot a histogram of the intensities across them. And so really what we should see is as we go from image frame 1 to image frame 2 in terms of our gating in time, and bear in mind the images are happening at the same time, it's just the gate that's moving in time, we'll see this transition of intensity from frame 1 slowly going down until we reach the interframe section, where it starts to drop down and become about level with frame 2's intensity, and then we'll see frame 2's intensity increase, frame 1's go to effectively nothing. And this will then give us a way of actually mapping out what this interframe time looks like for our particular camera, and should be quite a good illustrative example of this effect.
So in Solus, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change our region of interest now. So we go back to our full frame image, and then we can start acquiring some images.
And what we'll do is we'll set up our camera to take a 1000 frame kinetic series in PIV mode, with a 10 nanosecond gate step and a 10 nanosecond gate.
And so what we've done is we've taken a region of interest of our full frame image, and we have set the camera to external exposure mode. We're still in PIV fast dual frame mode. So we're in a mode where we can enable this 2 microsecond gap between two side-by-side exposures. And so what we're planning to do is, using a 10 nanosecond gate, is to walk across the interframe gap as I described, shown before here. And yes, so in walking across from the end of one exposure to another, we're hoping to demonstrate the crossover of intensity from one frame to another. So here's our region of interest that we've chosen, and we're now going to acquire. Just a quick on here. So we just cut the data down to this. So here we've taken our data and we've cut it down. So we've just got sort of the middle 500 to 700 counts. And what you can see, as we move along our data points, we're looking at the intensity of one frame and then the frame that's directly preceded it. And you can see, as we look at the odd frames, we're at, say, 1,658 counts, whereas on the even frames, we're at sort of 77 counts. So there's very little light in the even frames. But then as we move along this and we get a bit closer to this middle crossover point, we start to see the odd frame counts decreasing over time and the even frame counts increasing over time, to the point at which we reach this optical interframe gap, where we see the intensity cross over, and then it's the even frames that have the higher intensity, and the odd frames have the lower intensity, until it's pretty much all the intensity is then in the even frames. And this is a good way of observing the optical interframe gap. And this then allows you to have some idea of just how much sort of crossover you're going to have from one frame to another as you narrow down the window of time that you're looking at in your experiment.
Thank you for watching the Andor iStar sCMOS demo videos.